The courtroom in Galveston was unusually tense that morning. A thick humidity clung to the air, settling over the assembled crowd like an unseen weight. Men in tailored suits and women in modest dresses filled the wooden benches, their hushed murmurs blending into a low hum of anticipation. At the front of the room, behind an imposing oak bench, sat Judge John C. Watrous, a man known for his unshakable composure and unwavering commitment to the law. The case before him was no ordinary trial. A young man, barely past his teenage years, stood accused of forgery, a crime that carried a heavy penalty. His name was Samuel Reed, and from the moment he had been led into the courtroom in shackles, his demeanor had been one of silent despair. His brown eyes darted nervously from the judge to the assembled townsfolk, as if searching for a glimmer of mercy. A deep voice shattered the murmurs. "The United States v. Samuel Reed," the clerk announced, his tone formal and unwavering. "The charge, forgery of a financial document with intent to defraud." Judge Watrous leaned forward slightly, studying the young man before him. Samuel's hands trembled at his sides. The weight of the accusation, a federal offense, loomed over him like a storm cloud. The prosecuting attorney, a stern man named Edwin Harper, rose to his feet. "Your Honor, the crime of forgery is one that strikes at the very heart of our financial institutions," Harper began, his voice carrying an air of absolute certainty. "The defendant knowingly signed a fraudulent check, attempting to withdraw money that did not belong to him. It is theft by deception, a betrayal of trust. We must send a message that such deceit will not be tolerated." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Samuel flinched but said nothing. He cast a fleeting glance toward the small wooden pew where his mother and two younger siblings sat, their faces pale with fear. Judge Watrous took note of the moment. The boy's hands were calloused, a laborer's hands, not a criminal's. He had seen hardened men stand before him, liars who would say anything to escape punishment. But Samuel Reed did not look like one of them. There was something different about this case. Slowly, Judge Watrous turned to the defense attorney, William Pratt, a middle-aged man with a reputation for taking cases others wouldn't touch. "Does the defense wish to make an opening statement?" the judge asked. Pratt rose, adjusted his glasses, and took a measured breath. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. Then he turned to the jury. "I ask you not to judge my client by the crime alone, but by the circumstances that led to it." A hushed silence fell over the room. Even Judge Watrous felt a flicker of intrigue. Circumstances? What could possibly explain such an act? And more importantly, would the law allow room for mercy? A hush fell over the courtroom as William Pratt, the defense attorney, stepped forward. He was not known for theatrics, yet his words carried a quiet weight that made people listen. He turned to the jury, his expression measured, as though carefully balancing justice and mercy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pratt began, "before you stands a young man, not a hardened criminal, not a career fraudster, but a son, a brother, and a worker who made a desperate mistake." He paused, letting his words settle. Judge John C. Watrous observed Samuel Reed, the accused, closely. The young man had not raised his eyes from the wooden floor since entering the courtroom. His shackled hands were clenched together, as though bracing for an inevitable fate. Pratt continued, his voice calm but firm. "Samuel Reed did not forge a check to live lavishly. He did not seek riches or indulge in vice. He did it because, without that money, his family would have starved." A stir ran through the courtroom. A few spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The prosecutor, Edwin Harper, let out a sharp breath, already preparing a counter-argument. But Pratt pressed on. "Samuel has worked since he was 12 years old, taking whatever labor he could find to provide for his mother and two younger siblings after the passing of his father. But last month, when work ran dry, when wages failed, and when hunger knocked on his family's door, he saw no other way." Samuel's mother stifled a sob. The younger of his two sisters, barely 10, clutched at their mother's dress, her eyes round with fear. Pratt turned toward Judge Watrous, his gaze steady. "Yes, Your Honor, my client signed a fraudulent check. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was illegal, but he also knew his family had not eaten in 2 days. What would you have done if faced with that choice?" A long silence followed. The weight of the question hung thick in the air, as if the entire room had collectively held its breath. Judge Watrous allowed a slow exhale. The legal code was clear. Forgery was a serious offense, one that undermined the entire financial system. The law could not bend for personal misfortune. And yet, he glanced toward Samuel, who was now fighting back tears of humiliation. The boy's shame was evident. Before the judge could speak, Edwin Harper, the prosecutor, rose to his feet. "This is a court of law, not a court of emotion," Harper declared. His voice was sharp, clipped, intended to pierce through the sentiment in the room. "If we excuse crimes based on hardship, where does it end? Do we excuse the thief who steals from a merchant? The counterfeiter who claims desperation?" He turned, pacing slightly as he spoke. "We cannot let our sympathy cloud justice," he insisted. "The law must remain absolute, or it ceases to mean anything at all." The jury watched Judge Watrous expectantly. The tension in the room was palpable. The young forger sat motionless, awaiting his fate. Would the law see him as a criminal, or would it see him as something more? The courtroom was silent, save for the faint creak of the wooden benches as people shifted uneasily. The air was thick with expectation, a battle unfolding between law and mercy, and at its center stood Judge John C. Watrous. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on Samuel Reed, the young man accused of forgery. The boy's face was pale, his lips pressed together in a desperate attempt to hold back his emotions. His mother, seated behind him, clutched her youngest daughter's hand, her knuckles white. The prosecutor, Edwin Harper, took a deliberate step forward. "Your Honor," he began, his voice sharp as a blade, "we are not here to debate misfortune. We are here to uphold the law. This man, no matter how pitiful his circumstances, committed forgery, a federal offense." He turned to the jury, his stern gaze sweeping over them. "The law exists not to feel, but to protect. If we start excusing criminals based on their hardships, we set a dangerous precedent." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked away, uncomfortable with Harper's unyielding stance. Judge Watrous remained still, his expression unreadable. The defense attorney, William Pratt, straightened his jacket and stepped forward. "My learned colleague speaks of the law," Pratt said, his tone calm but firm. "And he is right. The law must be upheld." He paused, glancing at Samuel before turning back to the jury. "But the law is not just words on paper, it is meant to serve justice." Judge Watrous's gaze flickered ever so slightly at that word. Pratt continued, "Justice does not always mean harshness. It does not mean that we must break a man who has already been beaten down by life. Samuel Reed is not a danger to society. He is not a career criminal. He is a boy who made a single mistake, a mistake born not out of greed, but out of desperation." He turned to Judge Watrous directly. "Your Honor, the law gives you the power to judge not only the crime, but the man who committed it. Is this the face of a man who must be condemned?" All eyes turned to Judge Watrous. A long, heavy silence followed. The judge's fingers tapped lightly against the polished wood of his bench, a habit he had whenever deep in thought. The law was clear, but was it always right? Judge Watrous had spent years presiding over cases, and he had seen true criminals, men who lied, cheated, and stole without a shred of remorse. But this boy had acted out of love, not malice. Finally, the judge spoke. "Mr. Reed," he said, his deep voice breaking the stillness. Samuel hesitated, then looked up. "You understand the severity of what you've done?" Samuel swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was barely above a whisper. "And do you regret your actions?" Tears welled in Samuel's eyes. He took a shaky breath before answering. "More than anything, sir." Judge Watrous studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. The weight of his decision settled upon him. The law demanded punishment, but was punishment always justice? The courtroom held its breath. A heavy silence gripped the courtroom. Every pair of eyes locked onto Judge John C. Watrous. He sat unmoving, his fingers lightly drumming against the polished wood of the bench. A gesture only those who knew him well would recognize as the sign of a man deep in thought. Before him stood Samuel Reed, a young man whose entire future teetered on the edge of a single decision. His shackled hands trembled at his sides, but his gaze remained steady, filled with regret, fear, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Judge Watrous took a slow breath before speaking. "Samuel Reed," he said, his deep voice commanding the attention of every soul in the room. "This court does not take the crime of forgery lightly. It is an offense that strikes at the trust upon which society is built." Samuel swallowed hard, his knuckles white from gripping the edges of the defendant's table. His mother clutched her children tighter, her breath shallow with dread. However, the judge's voice softened, but the weight of his words did not lessen. Justice is more than punishment. It is the understanding that not all crimes are equal, and not all criminals are the same. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even Edwin Harper, the prosecutor, leaned forward slightly. Sensing the shift in tone, Judge Watrous continued, his eyes never leaving Samuel's. This court recognizes that you did not act out of malice, nor did you seek personal gain. You acted out of desperation, a desperation no man should ever have to endure. Samuel's lips parted slightly, as if he dared not believe what he was hearing. Judge Watrous straightened. For this reason, I am sentencing you to 1 year of imprisonment, with the possibility of early release upon good behavior. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Samuel's mother let out a sob, not of despair, but of relief. The townsfolk exchanged glances, their expressions torn between understanding and concern. The punishment was far lighter than many had expected. But Judge Watrous was not finished. I am also ordering that, upon your release, you shall be placed under a probationary work program, where you will repay the sum you attempted to take. The law must uphold accountability, but it must also recognize the potential for redemption. Samuel nodded rapidly, tears brimming in his eyes. Thank you, Your Honor, thank you. But while relief washed over some, unease settled upon others. From across the room, Edwin Harper frowned, his jaw tightening. He had seen men take advantage of mercy before. And what if this decision sent the wrong message? What if this leniency invited more crime? As the guards led Samuel Reed away, his mother and sisters clung to each other, weeping tears of both sorrow and gratitude. 1 year, a light sentence, but still, time lost. And yet Samuel had been given a second chance, a rarity in a courtroom like this. Judge Watrous sat back in his chair as the courtroom slowly emptied, his expression unreadable. Had he done the right thing? The days that followed answered that question in ways he never could have predicted. At first, the case was spoken of only in whispers. Some praised the judge's decision as an act of wisdom and compassion. Others feared it as a dangerous precedent. And then, the forgeries began to rise. Merchants and bankers started reporting an increase in fraudulent checks, each one carefully crafted, each one followed by a plea for mercy. The courthouse saw more and more cases where defendants cited poverty, desperation. Samuel Reed's case had become a benchmark. The courts will be lenient, some criminals whispered. Judge Watrous soon found himself presiding over more forgery cases than ever before. His ruling in the United States versus Samuel Reed had been meant to encourage rehabilitation, but now it was being manipulated as a loophole. The very thing he had hoped to prevent had begun to take root. One evening, Judge Watrous sat in his dimly lit office, rereading the legal briefs piling up before him. Case after case, forgery, fraud, counterfeit documents. He had tried to show that justice could be merciful, but now, criminals were exploiting the very leniency he had extended to Samuel Reed. A knock at his door broke his thoughts. Edwin Harper entered, his face shadowed with the weariness of a man who had seen too much. With all due respect, Judge, Harper said, setting a stack of new cases onto the desk. I warned you. Watrous looked at him, his fingers steepled. He did not respond immediately. Harper sighed. Compassion is a virtue, Judge, but in a courtroom, it can also be a weakness. Watrous let out a slow breath. So what do you propose? Harper's reply was immediate. We must restore deterrence. The judge nodded, already knowing what had to be done. In the months that followed, the courts adopted harsher sentencing for forgery. Strict penalties, fewer exceptions.